Our next panel is going to be talking about the thorny challenge, I think it's a very thorny challenge, of how we measure the value of arts and culture. So, to talk us through this, I'd like to invite our next panelists up. We have Ruth Claxton, the artist and founding director of East Side Projects, Rishi Coupland, who's the head of research and insight here at the BFI, Gerwin Evans, who's deputy director of Creative Wales, Harman Sagar, who is the head economist for arts, heritage and tourism at DCMS. And our chair will be Frans Anderson, who is director of arts programs and investments at Nesta. So, you know the drill by now, questions to Slido, and I'm going to hand over to Fran and our panel. Please give them a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, lovely to be here. I'm Fran. I'm a white lady, probably look about as knackered as a single parent to two teenagers normally does. I'm wearing a blue dress from Peopletree, and I just looked up Peopletree, and they've been around for 31 years, and I think I bought it shortly after they launched. And I'm also wearing my running shoes, which is my usual state of affairs. I'll just quickly address as well, because we've had a couple of comments about Nesta in the room, and I just want to reassure that the impact funds that my team runs will be continuing. We're going to be launching an independent organisation which, together with the PEC in its new home, we hope will replicate all of the best of Nesta, except, unfortunately, the endowment. So there will be, watch this space for more news on that front. Really exciting panel to be chairing, because we're running the impact investment funds, and I've come from the investment universe. I think possibly other than the Treasury, there's no one like investors to focus on linear metrics in one number, and what we're trying to do as part of our work at Nesta and beyond is to make sure that the creative industries and arts and culture get access to this huge tidal wave of impact investment, this big movement that's happening now where investors are trying to get more for their money than just financial return. And obviously a key element of that is how you know what you're getting other than the financial return. I think compared to other areas of impact investment, one of the cases we always try and make is that arts and creativity in general, the impact is complex, it's intersectional, and it's diffuse, so it's spread across various areas. And that's actually a feature, not a bug, of our sector and the industry. But that's enough. But anyway, just setting the scene, I want to talk to the much more interesting panelists. Ruth, I wonder if you could start by talking from your perspective as an artist and creator of many interesting initiatives. Alison earlier said, measure but don't over-measure. Mm-hmm. From your perspective, what are the pitfalls, the challenges of measuring and being able to articulate your impact and what you've the impact of what you've done and created?
Yeah, sure. I'm Ruth. I'm a white person. I have grey hair and glasses. I'm wearing a khaki shirt, I suppose is the word, and black trousers. I may well be slightly blotchy because I'm nervous, but there you go. I've not done one of these for ages, I've just realised. So I suppose really I would quite like to just do a little shout out for the power of the arts to be the thing that you don't really know what you're going to get. And that, like the magic of that, there's a nice little quote that we've been using recently at Eastside Projects from some people called Artist Placement Group, which is that artists watch the doings and listen to the noises. And I feel like that could be a really interesting thing for anyone involved in policy to think of and have as a kind of way of being as well, because that's what I feel like measuring, evaluating all those things should be. And I think there is a danger, particularly at the moment, just thinking about the data that we have to collect for the Arts Council, the way the MPO applications are put together, the way project grant applications are put together, that the measurement has the potential to limit the creative possibilities. And so I just think it's really important to kind of, collecting data is really, really useful. Being able to make a case is really useful, but I think there are some really interesting questions about who's framing those questions, how collaborative that framing is being, who is creating the structures that those questions get asked in, how accessible that is. You know, I have audience finder surveys that are 1 million pages long that loads of people that only certain people will fill out in my gallery. You know, and then with Steamhouse, which was an innovation centre that we developed over the last 7 years from an idea in a pub to a collaboration with Birmingham City University, there was an evaluation done about that, but I think the really interesting thing about it is it only asked the people who engaged what they thought of Steamhouse. You know, so I suppose I think thinking about those. And then the other thing that I just wanted to say was about timescales. And so Steamhouse was open for 5 years, 2 of which it wasn't open because there was a pandemic, essentially, and there were lots of, and it's a makerspace, so there were lots of challenges there. But I think even with Eastside, we've been going for 15 years. A lot of what we do is talent development. We've never really had the skills or the money to put like proper longitudinal studies in place. I know there's massive things that have happened across 15 years. I know that people came into Steamhouse who perhaps have been community artists for the last 20 years, thought they were going to come and do some of their own practice and ended up playing with VR and 3D printing, which they didn't expect. I don't know what they're going to do in 8 years' time, but I think it's also really important to be thinking long-term, to be thinking about funding long-term, to be kind of, just thinking about different timelines.
Brilliant, thank you. That's interesting. I spoke to someone recently who said they filled in an application form and they got to the end and they're like, when are they going to ask me what the project is?
Well, they don't ask you what the project is. My advice to everyone is put it in the PDF because they just don't ask you anymore.
Rishi, can you tell us a little bit about projects you've been involved with where you think that gathering data is not just sort of informative when you've got the data, but it's actually critical to the development and the execution of the project?
Yeah, sure. So just how I look, I'm a British South Asian man with glasses, a beard, wearing a brown top and grey trousers. So yeah, I think in my experience there are 3 reasons, and each of them are good in their own way for measuring the value of culture and creativity, and it can be an off-putting term because it feels reductive, just putting trying to put hard figures on value. One of the reasons, obviously, is to try and capture a value in a way that's just useful for things like bids, applying bids, making the case for public funding. So people will sometimes go down that route. A second reason is because you want to test an assumption or validate what you already know. And Ruth, you talked about knowing something about changes you'd seen over a period of time, and sometimes measuring can validate that. But the third reason is the one I'll build on because I think it's in some ways the most interesting, which is to say sometimes in attempting to measure the value, you actually start to peel the onion effectively and really peel back the layers of value that people have in culture and not just end up with a number or a set of numbers, but a better understanding that you didn't have before, because everything, even those of us who are very, very experienced in our fields, live our lives by heuristics and assumptions as well. But actually get a better understanding. Just briefly, you asked for a couple of examples. I guess one of the studies that happened at the BFI, and actually Harry was very involved in it, was a study of the making online access to the BFI Film Archive available for free. Britain on Film, a set of films available for free. So a really proper economic analysis was done. And yes, there was a clunking great figure number that's very juicy and helpful of people who got it for free would have been prepared to spend £3 a month if they were paying for it. Now that's useful. That will go into bid applications and will help strengthen our case. But beyond that, the study also identified that there are a group of people who never accessed this, but who valued it. And what an incredible concept to have that validated, that actually people support the concept of Britain's heritage being available on film, even if they themselves haven't accessed it. And that should be at the heart of our communications and the heart of our strategy and the heart of how we position ourselves. And that study also uncovered that there were elements of well-being inherent in the value that people put on online access to these films. And that was the study only started the ball rolling on there, but that's going to be a big part of what we uncover in future. So it really opened up worlds to us, worlds of value that we weren't aware of. There's another. I might give one more brief example, I guess. this one from a previous life. I used to work for the National Theatre. And we did a study of trying to understand what happens psychologically, what motivates people to watch theatre psychologically, and with the neuroscience department at Reading. And one of the things we found, we didn't intend to find this, but because we put out a national survey, we found that in the UK, the majority of people who attach a value to theatre don't go to theatre very often. They go less frequently than once a year. They might go once every 4 years. That's the majority of people who value theatre. Who do we survey all the time to discover about the arts? People who attend very regularly. And so in a way, we discovered that we're disenfranchising our own understanding of our own art forms by the methods we use. And we can only discover that if we set out on this journey to measure value and culture. Yes, it can feel reductive. Yes, we're still finding out how well to do it, but it can actually take us to very, very interesting new places as well.
Thanks, Rishi. That echoes some of our experience with investees that we've worked with and going through a theory of change process, and they've actually given us really positive feedback about understanding how to measure and how to work out whether the stuff they're doing is working. Harry, you've spent, I think, a really long time working on establishing the Culture and Heritage Capital Framework. Can you tell us a little bit about it? And if you don't mind, could you tell us a bit about where it works and what its known limitations are?
Yeah, and so I'm Harry, or Harman Sagar is my official name, but please do call me Harry. I'm South Asian as well, and wearing a tie, which I don't normally wear, by the way, so very uncomfortable. So the question is that I think today actually everyone's talked, and I feel like every creative industries leader has probably the GVA number tattooed to them, and they talk about it in every presentation. But one of the things probably misunderstood as an economist is people think economists are only interested in GDP. And the big movement in the space has been a movement beyond GDP and actually looking at what actually should be valued and what matters to people. And so that's a big piece of work the ONS are doing. And actually, Mano Hassan just published a paper with the ONS on looking at capital accounting. And we've going to take a lot of inspiration from the natural capital world. So hence why we've kind of landed on this kind of term, cultural heritage capital. But actually, for many of you, you probably know it just as valuing culture. And so what we're really trying to move away from, and I think actually few people have talked about this days, but we're trying to move away from is creating a balanced argument that economic, social, environmental and cultural benefits are all on the same plane, on the same level, and actually talked about at the same level. Obviously, as an economist, what we will then do is we try to put a value on that in monetary terms. So that's our kind of broad concept of the Cultural Heritage Capital Project. Now, just to kind of talk about that in a more or less kind of abstract way, I think today we talked about skills and cultural education. We've talked about that in many of the cases. We talk about wage remuneration, and we talk about that GVA impact. But actually, if you just look at wage, we're not really telling the full story. If we make decisions on cultural education and skills on wage, we aren't taking into account of what we as economists call the full welfare effect on society. So while we don't have a way of doing it yet, there is a way, hopefully in the future, that we can say it's not just about the remuneration, it's not about the GVA impact of organisation. You've got to add the social impact into that when making considerations. So that's kind of more of a, kind of another concept. But the other point of this is that, as Rishi was saying, what we then need to unpack is who's benefiting. Just having big numbers doesn't really mean anything. You then have to actually apply it to go, well, who's benefiting and who isn't? And then also, it's not just the economics, it's multidisciplinary. So that's one of the challenges actually we've had, is trying to bring economists, arts, humanities, social researchers, and heritage experts like heritage scientists together. And I'm about to publish a paper soon, which is trying to bridge the link between heritage scientists and economists. And I think that actually is the most exciting piece, that we actually all start talking to each other. And I think obviously the work we've done with the PEC in the last few years is very much about bringing those disciplines together, and working with the Centre for Cultural Value as well. So one big caveat I would say is we also need to be careful, right? So use the evidence that works for the decision you're making. Stuff that we're doing on social cost benefit analysis may not be useful for every decision. Also, it's very expensive as well. And also, what we need to be is proportionate to that decision making. Just creating evidence for evidence sake is not that useful. You need to fixate on who you're trying to convince and what will convince them. What we're trying to do is actually fill a gap where a lot of decisions which need social cost benefit analysis don't actually currently have any way of doing it. We're hoping we're going to fill that gap, and when people need it, they can use it. If they don't need it, they will use other evidence, whether it's narrative, qualitative, or other decision process. So we're really kind of adding to the armoury here. But that's the real challenge here is, first of all, probably getting people to understand that economists aren't just interested in GVA. We are interested in lots of things. And I would draw you to a paper actually Hassan wrote probably about 15, 12 years ago on economists are here to help you. So that's our challenge. And I think the final thing, which I'll talk about at the end, is probably around skills, but I'll come back to that a bit later.
Brilliant, thank you so much. That leads us on nicely, actually, to Gerwin, because I was going to ask about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which was referred to earlier, and whether actually that does encapsulate some of Paul's point about hope and imagination.
Yeah.
But, you obviously are looking at financial measures, and if you want to talk a bit about what you're doing and the measures that you're using to kind of prove the success and value and get reinvestment in the programmes that you're running.
Great. Prynawn da, good afternoon, everyone. Gerwin Evans, white middle-aged male, brown hair, pretty untidy beard, jeans and a grey jacket. So, yeah, I work in Creative Wales, which is a government department. We're answerable to Welsh ministers, so slightly different to some of the structures around the rest of the UK. So we only set up in 2020, so what we've done, while we use the DCMS definition of the value of creative industries, we don't look after all those creative industries in terms of what our remit is. We focus down in Wales on the screen sector, the digital sector, gaming, animation, special effects, commercial music sector and publishing. So we spend a lot of time understanding the evidence base of those 4 sectors so that we can see the growth in the GVA. I've got that number tattooed on my shoulder. The jobs, the business growth, death, etc. So then we can write to Welsh ministers and have the evidence base to ask for more budget, because we can see whether those sectors are being impacted positively by our intervention. So, as an example, if we invest in screen production, so the screen sector in Wales is booming at the moment, lots of productions happening, and when we invest, we ask for a minimum of 10-to-1 return. And that has to be demonstrated by a full accountant's report in terms of the spend in the local economy, the hospitality, the electricians, the riggers, the hair and makeup, etc., etc. So for a 10-to-1 return, if we invest in $1 million, we want 10 million evidence in that local economy. But more and more, to Harry's point, is we're moving into the well-being space. Fair Work, which is brought out in the PEC report, is a big focus for the Welsh Government. There's issues in the screen sector around well-being at the moment, which I know many colleagues in the room will know. So we're starting to understand how our interventions can help in that space. So we have the Wellbeing of Future Generations in Wales, which is a law. It's an act in law. Everything we do, every policy intervention we do has to be seen, to the gentleman's point on the last panel, in the eyes of future generations, as the name says. So we can't do anything that damages those opportunities and that hope and growth that we're all looking for through our intervention. So it's a really interesting piece of legislation and law that's looked at quite positively around the world in terms of what we do in there. So yeah, but our interventions from a government perspective have to be evidence-based, and we're drilling down to our interventions that we can stand up in conferences like this and say our interventions have led to these numbers or they haven't. So slightly different to a lot of the other panel members. But one example I was going to use to highlight a lack of information within government as well is we were asked to design and deliver the Culture Recovery Fund for Wales through COVID. And as part of that in Wales, we delivered a freelancer fund as well, which I don't think all parts of the UK did that, but we did over 18 million pound to 3,500 freelancers through that fund. But when I first sat down and was asked by ministers to do it, I said, right, where's the evidence based on freelancers? And we had none. So I had to base the criteria and the scheme design on self-employed, which meant when we opened the scheme, Cardiff closed within 5 minutes because the numbers were so wrong that we had to redesign the scheme based on the actual numbers of freelancers that were out in Wales, in different parts of Wales. So, but what that's led to is a clear need for Welsh Government to understand the freelance community better. We've done a lot of work with freelancers over the past 18 months, and which has resulted in a freelancer pledge where the public sector in Wales and freelance community aim to work better together, because it was quite clear we spoke different languages and all these different things. So, but it was an eye-opener to me when trying to design that scheme on day one, that when I went to look for the evidence, it just wasn't there. So it's interesting that there's lots of evidence in some spaces, but then there's a lack of evidence in other spaces which are really important to the creative industries because it's driven by freelancers, isn't it? So
that actually brings me on to, I was thinking about the whether there's a question implicit in the title of the panel, and is making the case for creativity always about measuring the value. Trevor's actually put it more succinctly than me. Trevor McFarlane, thank you. How can we raise up the status of high quality excuse me, qualitative data amongst policymakers, including in the Treasury. So, you know, this is a storytelling sector. How do we tell our stories better? Ruth, do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh, I'd love to know.
I'd love to have space to tell your story on the forum.
I mean, I'd love to have time, actually. You know, our organisation has received the same amount of money from the Arts Council for the last 15 years. So effectively, we've, you know, that's a lot less now. You know, so, and all the small organisations that I know at the moment are really struggling. Loads of the freelancers that I know through Steamhouse and EOP are really struggling because less galleries are doing less shows, therefore there's less work for technicians, therefore there's less work for artists, therefore there's less work for, you know, it's just like this kind of ricochet scenario that's happening at the moment that's coming out of the fact that that everyone's just had standstill funding for the last, I don't even know how long now. So one of the big things I think is capacity in relation to that, and I think there is, like in Birmingham, I'm talking about clusters before, in Digbeth where we are, across the last 15 years, a whole load of visual arts organisations have grown and developed that now are nationally recognised as being super interesting small-scale organisations, doing really great work. They're all about incubation, and they're all about kind of supporting people, at not necessarily emerging artists at the very beginning of their career either, but people with opportunities to take risks. And pretty much everyone is currently under threat because the media people have now recognised that part of the city as a really great creative place to be, and of course they have more money. So I feel like for the publicly funded arts, there's a real kind of crisis coming actually in terms of the capacity to tell, the smaller scale organisations' capacity to tell their story. So like about every 2 years, someone will come round and interview us all about creative clusters, and we say the same things, and and it never seems to really make a difference. So yeah, I mean, it sounds quite depressing, but it is quite depressing, really, you know. But I think there are amazing stories to be told, and if maybe it's that researchers should focus on those small-scale organisations differently, you know, that might be a bit more difficult and might have to have a different kind of structure for them to be able to support that research. But it feels like that maybe that knowledge isn't quite there, or the case isn't being quite made. Like we can't go, yeah, we get, you know, 7,000 people are going to brush past this public artwork, because that's not necessarily how we're working, you know. But we do really great work. That's really important.
That's a really good point, right? That the value is obviously seen by the people who are moving in, and then that value is crystallised by private capital that is investing and crowding out artists who can't afford. So that's a kind of implicit measure of value, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's not working to the benefit of the artists who are creating it.
No.
Did anyone else have thoughts, Harry, thinking about qualitative data? And obviously you're in the position who's having to make these cases, and you're an economist, but how can we strengthen the case for financially focused, and I include investors in that, financially focused parties, that there is huge value here?
Yeah, so I think the question around qualitative, I think it's never either or, right? You do both. You use the evidence that you have and that you can produce. So there's no case I've ever seen that just is numbers, right? I've never seen a case like that. And one of the great things about our sector is when you read these business cases, and let's be honest, if you've read a business case and you're not in the cultural sector, they can be a bit bland. But when you read a cultural one, it's so much more interesting because they sell a vision, an idea, and you need that qualitative information, how it affects people. Then you get into the hard numbers, but you can't do it without the narrative and the qualitative information first. One of the things actually we're trying to think about with the CHC project, because I think people often think that the Green Book is an immovable object. The Green Book is the kind of way that we look at public investment. But if there is a way of connecting the kind of qualitative information to effectively driving the understanding of value in the approach we're taking the Green Book, that it's open to that. You know, we've done a lot of work in the last decade of getting well-being in. While it ends up with a metric, it did start off with the qualitative information. So I think we're open to that. But I would say, you know, we're in a massively privileged sector in the sense that we can tell amazing stories and inspire that person like me who, you know, all about numbers to go, actually, this is quite exciting. And by page 3, I'm usually like, let's fund the whole thing. But obviously then you have to actually read all the numbers and make it stack up. But it's amazing when you read things like this is the greatest thing ever. And actually the other thing I would say, and that's why it's important to have those in the cases, because sometimes when I talk to, and I'm being at the BFI for a few years and talking to Ben Roberts, who's now the CEO, you talk to him and he's really excited you about the project. But I'm like, well, Ben, you're not in the room all the time. So we need to get it on paper as well, and I think that's quite important. So I think we should be doing both, and that's why we should be using every avenue we've got and every lever and evidence approach we've got, and use the one that works. But obviously, we're coming as an economist from a very specific approach, where we're trying to fill a big gap, which is a gap really important when you start talking to other departments who use that approach.
I think Wales is obviously the land of storytellers. That's a given, I think. So what we have tried to do is align the creative industries and the growth of creative industries to other sectors. Welsh language is obviously important, education. So I know there's been a lot of chat today about curriculum. Well, creativity is on the curriculum in Wales. There's a new curriculum starting next year where creativity starts from the age of 3. And that's really, really important for us. And hopefully in the next generation we'll see the fruits of that policy change around curriculum. But it's really important to sell that narrative to the decision makers. So the Deputy Minister for Culture, Arts and Sport in Welsh Government is based in a constituency called Merthyr Tydfil, which is a Valleys town, old industrial heritage, so the social deprivation issues that go with that, based mainly on coal. So the message I get the Deputy Minister to talk when she's out in giving presentations is content is our new coal. Because it can be generational like the coal industry was, because content is everything. And I think someone mentioned all jobs coming out, they're going to have some form of creativity in them. So it's that narrative and getting decision makers and everyone involved in selling and growing the creative industries, driving forward behind that one narrative of why it is so important to grow it. So there's a number of factors, the well-being of future generations, as you said as well. We try and tie in as many agendas as we can with the real ambition of growing the creative industries, because we believe it's the right thing to do for the economy and for the social landscape in Wales as well.
I've got a question here.
I just sort of thought about a way we did tell the story really well, which is that we produce manuals which are kind of guides to how you might use these side projects, and we produced one that was called The Artist and the Engineer, which is the coat of arms of Birmingham has an engineer. It's like industry and creativity, and one of our founding directors noticed that when he was on the bus, and it's a children's story. And we gave it to lots of people. And one of the really great things for me about Steamhouse is that I hear people in the university now using the phrase the artist and the engineer, and I know we made that up. So I think you can, and we did that really intentionally. And we took it into the city and we talked to the planning people about it, and we're now part of the design team on the Smithfield markets, which is going to be the new markets of Birmingham. And when we were applying for that and making the pictures for that, the artist and the engineer were in the centre of that as well, because of the collaboration with the architects. So maybe so you can do it creatively.
That's brilliant, thank you. I've got a question here, if I can make the thing work again, from Valentina Oru, thank you. Reflecting on the contradiction between the emphasis on economic value of the sector and the low pay for artists, how can we shift the narrative here? How can individuals be valued for the work they're doing whilst we're in this situation that Ruth just talked eloquently about, where we've got a finite pot of funding, which is essentially a sort of compound contraction, and that's reducing capacity in a sort of accelerating way. So how can we shift the narrative when the arts are so underpaid structurally for individuals? Again, might be one that everyone would like to know the answer to.
It's back to the Fair Work agenda, isn't it? So within Wales, if we're going to give finance to a business, they have to sign up to something called an economic contract, and that sets out what their sustainability plans are, what their Fair Work plans are, and different things. So we're very proactive in that space in terms of only working with organisations that pay fairly, etc. So it's important that we do that at that early stage. But in Wales, as I mentioned, the screen sector is doing very well. The arts sector coming out of COVID is still struggling. The theatre sector, we're losing lots of people from the theatre sector to the screen sector because the wages are better and there's more opportunities. So it's that fine balance, isn't it, to having a sustainable year-round ecosystem with people with the skill sets that can move around those different sectors. But Fair Work is definitely something that we're trying to resolve through our contracts to make sure that people are being paid appropriately for their work.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that, and actually I think there is an interesting question. I'm not sure there's something PEC will probably take up in the next few years. Is as I just said, we talk about 103 billion in GVA. Right, if you work that out per worker, that's an incredible GVA per worker. So why isn't that reflected in wage? So I think that's an interesting question: is where is that value going, given we're a very labour-intensive set of sectors? So I don't have the answer to that, but I think that is an interesting question of why is there low pay?
Yeah, and the implications on productivity and nationally, and how much productivity is sitting within this sector as well.
I just think that organisations have to do less until the situation changes, though, as well. Like, we are doing less projects, but we're paying artists a £10,000 fee. And we're a very small arts organisation. And we can do 7 of them across 3 years.
So I think that goes back to where is that, who is that GVA benefiting is the question.
Yeah. But I also think that it should have been part of, I don't really understand why there isn't a line for artist fees in everyone's MPO application. Because there should be. It should be completely clear. And I'm an artist as well. I know the reality of the fees that people are being offered, and it's rubbish in the visual arts. It's immoral often by big institutions. There's a really interesting, it hasn't got loads and loads of data, but it's got some really interesting kind of quotes in it by an organisation called We Industria, published with AN, I think, published a report recently about the kind of structural inequities within the visual arts in particular. And I think, the sector needs to take a good look at itself, really, because the marketing people aren't being paid that. So.
And is there potentially something there about, Tom, I think, was talking about enterprise allowance scheme and thinking about how you can empower organisations to pay properly at their nascent stages?
I mean, we have artist curator traineeships. They do 18 months. It's a super holistic training programme. They leave and they go, and one of our recent ones just got a job at Unlimited. They go into good jobs in interesting places where all this value comes out of it. We pay real living wage. That's what we can afford to pay, but we pay the real living wage. And we give them money to make their own project as part of it. If we can do it, everyone can. You don't just have to sit young people on a desk. They can be much more than that, I think.
Yeah, it is about leading by example, isn't it? So Annie's asked a question which has got lots of thumbs up. This discussion begs the question of whose value. So who is defining value and on what terms? And I think that's kind of, I was going to ask that we get a lot of questions because I think it's very important. There's a lot of voices in this conversation, not just ours. So has anyone got any thoughts on that?
I think it's a really good question, and I think that can be, if you structure these kinds of studies and this kind of inquiry correctly, you basically almost tackle that as an intrinsic part of the study. I think that there's sometimes a fear in asking, for example, if I go beyond people who I know already highly value what we do, they'll come back with a smaller answer, or I won't feel very valued. But actually, as we've tried to be, and there's an amount of bravery needed here, as we've tried to expand it further, I think the results are encouraging. There is, people have always done culture before there was an Arts Council or a BFI or anything like that. It isn't, there's a reason why human beings gravitate towards it. And so there is a value there. And so asking and discovering, some people value it less than others, we shouldn't be afraid of doing that. So I think that, I'm hoping I've now interpreted the question right, but I think being broad as possible and trying to just look across the piece will uncover things you hadn't expected. I remember, and it's about being brave. I remember when I was working with an exec director of a cultural institution, and we were thinking about whether to partner with Nesta, actually, on a research project that might have revealed that our work was of less value than we thought. And I said, how do you feel about this? And he just said, I think I'd rather know. And I think that's exactly the attitude you have to take. You should try and know, and not be afraid of finding out areas where there are differing views of your work, because we have to believe we're sectors that can change in response to that.
yeah, and it's really only rigorous if you don't know the answer someone's going to give you. So,
Yeah.
Gowan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it has to be the value of the individual, doesn't it? And kind of, as a government, that's what we have to drive for, is growth that's inclusive and diverse as possible as well. So making sure that we provide those opportunities. So we run a lot of entry-level schemes, but the difficulty we find is some of those communities we target in, they don't drive, they can't get to the opportunities, so it's putting on that extra support level to get people transport into those opportunities. So there's different value sets within different communities as well, which I think you need to take into consideration. So yeah, it has to be about the individual, and them collectively growing together then grows the economy, doesn't it? So.
And Ruth, can I just turn that question to you, because you've obviously had kind of expanding audience as your work has expanded. How has that felt in terms of, whose value are you looking at?
I mean, I think that's been really interesting over the last few years as we've really thought about how we diversify our programme, how we look for artists differently. We made EOP free for people with global majority heritage or who identified as disabled during COVID when Black Lives Matter happened, because that felt like a thing. And so actually the demographic in various parts of the organisation has really changed, and we've also set up lots more. We have a cultural citizens panel, we have a EOP thinkers panel that helps us to understand the value, so we have honest conversations with people that are receiving our work super directly. So, I mean, I think the question for policy people is what value you're looking for gets decided in the first place, and where the people on the kind of coalface, so to speak, where they are in that process, so that, yeah, obviously you might need particular pieces of evidence in order to convince particular people, but actually you could also be getting something else at the same time that might be useful. It might be something you've not thought of in terms of what could be interesting because you're an economist and I'm a sculptor. So I think that, I would also advocate for the Artist Placement Group put artists in placements in government departments.
Yep.
And I think that's something that would be a really super interesting thing to think about, because there's some amazing brains in the arts world that could really just kind of come in sideways, do that little slither through the gap that artists do, and that would be an amazing way to spend 10 grand, for example. It's not a bad fee rate, ideally more, but to get a little bit of as a kind of researcher, as a sort of provocateur, as a little grist in the mill.
I would like to just put in there that we did put artists in the Nesta strategy process, so I don't know why the artists didn't come out in the strategy. Gowan, thinking about the value to the nation, and talking about the kind of, if we link back to the soft power panel earlier, did you have anything to say on that?
Obviously, creativity in the creative industries are huge for nation brand building, and we work with UK government and other partners to do that at appropriate levels, but where we see opportunities to do it on a Wales-specific level, we will do that. So as a recent example, we took 18 businesses out to the GDC, the Big Games Development Conference in San Francisco. So Little Old Wales was in between a stand between Unity and Ubibox, two of the biggest gaming companies in the world. And that was all about brand building and nation building. People who come up saying, Wales, is that spelled with a H? So we had a lot of informing Americans that no, it's not spelled with a H. It's spelled like that. So that's important for us. The music scene is important for us. We've obviously a great tradition in Wales around music, and that's an important part of our nation building. So yeah, we work with partners around the UK to do that international, global brand building, but where we see a real benefit for when it's for Wales, we take the opportunity to do that.
Thank you. We were going to try and give a bit of a colour of all of our work at the end, but I'm sure everyone's around if people want to come and talk to them and hear more about what everyone's doing. But thank you very much for your time.